And now let me now introduce our first keynote speaker, whose name is very popular among Vietnamese researchers and educators. He has close connection with Vietnam as the one who bridged our country with Australia and the world, when leading many projects for Vietnam higher education, sponsored by ADB and the World Bank. Many of his former students have registered to listen to his lecture today. And now he will be sharing with us his expert opinion on approaches taken to students' assessment in school, vocational education and training, and higher education sectors. Also, current trends in students' assessment practice in Australia will be discussed. At present, Vietnam is under the bigger change in education. We are now applying formative assessment in school and promoting competency-based and outcome-based. The lesson learned from other countries will surely be a good reference for us. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome a very special guest from Southern Cross University, Australia, Professor Martin Hayden. Please welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Na. It is a great pleasure to be with you. I hope you're hearing me clearly enough.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
It's around about 1 hour, 13 minutes past 1 o'clock here in Australia. So I've been anticipating this presentation all morning. I wish I could be there in person, but it is lovely to join you virtually. So my topic is student assessment practices in Australia. This is an area that I have been involved in professionally for most of my career, which is now almost 40 years, both mainly as a practitioner, but also as somebody who has been advising academic staff, particularly academic staff, about matters of assessment. Through my involvement as the Dean of a teacher education faculty, I've also taken a keen interest in this topic because our student teachers need to be well prepared in terms of their assessment abilities when they go into schools. I have been coming and going to Vietnam for the last 15 years, and most of my work in Vietnam has been in the area of policy, broadly speaking about governance and finance and quality assurance. I really haven't looked closely at assessment practices in Vietnam, but I have had one PhD candidate from Vietnam who has looked very closely at assessment practices in Vietnam. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to go back to her thesis to refresh my memory of the experience of Vietnam, of assessment in Vietnam. So I'll draw a little bit on that as I speak. What I want to do in the presentation is to provide some insights about assessment practices in Australia. This is a very big topic. Indeed, it's too big almost. So what I'm attempting to do may be a little bit superficial in the sense that I'm touching on some issues, but beneath each of these issues are a lot of other issues. So it's a bit like an iceberg. I'm touching at the part you can see on the top, but there's a lot more underneath. My focus in preparing the paper was to say something that might be of value to Vietnamese readers. So I didn't want to go into too much detail, but I did want to explain some points that I think may be relevant to the Vietnamese experience. The sequence that I'm following is threefold. First of all, I'll speak about some contextual features of the education system in Australia. Then I'd like to look at the different approaches to assessment that exist between the three major sectors in our education system. And finally, I'd like to introduce some noteworthy trends. All of this material is documented in a paper that I sent only yesterday. I just couldn't get it done on time to get into the proceedings, but the paper was sent yesterday to Professor Na. And so I hope anyone who's interested in the topic in detail will have a look at the paper, which has much more information than I can possibly deal with in this short presentation. So starting then with the contextual features of the education system in Australia, the three major sectors are the schools sector, the vocational education and training sector, and the higher education sector. The school sector, 3.65 million students, that's about 1/4 the size of Vietnam, but then the population of Australia is about 1/4 the size of Vietnam. So the proportion is comparable, although Vietnam has a younger population and therefore more young people in school. So 3.65, and all of us, nearly all of our students attending school are full-time. The second sector is the vocational education and training sector, and this is quite a large sector in terms of students enrolled, but as you can see, less than 1/3 of them study full-time. Most of the training programs offered in this sector are short-term and part-time. Sometimes they're only for a couple of weeks. Sometimes they can be for a couple of years, but mostly the students who are doing these programs are working full-time and studying part-time. The students who are studying full-time would mainly be doing short, intense courses. But it's a rather large sector, 4.2 million students involved in this sector, large for Australia. And finally, it's just the higher education sector with 1.6 million students, and 2/3 of these are studying full-time. Most of the part-time students in the sector will be doing postgraduate studies. A smaller proportion are doing undergraduate studies on a part-time basis. So those are the three sectors, and I'll be referring to them as I proceed. A map of Australia. Why am I showing a map of Australia? Because when we talk about the education system in Australia, it's very important to understand the federal state structure. Back in 1901, the colonies, they were British colonies in Australia, joined together to form a federal government, and a constitution was drawn up. What was particular about that constitution was that most of the powers were retained by the individual states. And one of those powers was in relation to education. So what we've had for most of the past 100 years is a situation in which each of the states, and now the two territories, are managing their own education systems. And as you can imagine, that's been very confusing, because when families moved from one state to another, the children were required to adjust to a different education system. The pattern recently has been to bring all of these education systems under one umbrella. That happened earlier in the higher education sector. In fact, in 1975, the federal government took over the management of all universities. In the schools and the VET sector, however, it's been a lot slower. The discussions started during the 1990s, and it's only really in the last 10 years that there have been national agreements struck, so that now we have one curriculum for schools all across the country, and we have one authority responsible for the vocational education and training sector. However, the tensions continue to exist. States still feel, particularly in relation to schools and vocational education and training, that they own those sectors, whereas the federal government feels that it should be establishing national standards for schools and vocational education and training. I'll come back to that point a little later. Curriculum policy is developed in the school sector by a body called the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. That agency has been in existence since 2008. It's supported by both the state and the federal governments, and it has made a big impact by developing a document called the Australian Curriculum. And it's the Australian Curriculum which is followed by all states and territories in Australia. The second sector, vocational education and training, is under the control of a body called the Australian Skills Quality Authority. The acronym is ASQA. And that body has been in existence since 2011. And its role is to accredit all training providers in the VET area. The third body that has a recently, it was established in 2011, the third body is responsible for the university sector, or more broadly, the higher education sector. Let me just explain that when I talk about the higher education sector, it includes universities plus a number of other higher education providers. Universities account for about 95% of the sector. So basically, we're talking about universities. This body, the acronym is TEXA, is responsible basically for the quality of the sector. It's different from the other two bodies, ACARA and ASQA, in that it doesn't dictate what universities should teach. What it does do is re-register the universities on a regular basis, in the process looking at the extent to which they are complying with their own rules and regulations and their own standards. But it doesn't dictate what they should teach. Just going back to ACARA, it does dictate what should be taught in schools, and ASQA approves all of the training programs that are taught in the VET sector. I'd like to turn now to the second area to address, that is differences according to the sectors in their approaches to student assessment. In the school sector, the approach to assessment that's taken is called standards-based. A standards-based approach is one where the standards that will be applied to the assessment of students are made clear in advance. The content can be varied, but the standards must apply across the country. These standards are quite detailed, and in my paper I've given some examples of them, but I'll come back to speak more about those standards in a moment. But it's a standards-based approach to assessment. In the VET sector, the approach to assessment is what we call a competency-based approach. And when I come to look more closely at that, I'll explain how, in fact, the focus is very much on the measurement of the extent to which students have been able to display competency in a particular area of skill. In the higher education sector, the approach is referred to as an outcomes-based approach. And let me explain that in a little more detail in just a moment. First of all, with the schools sector, the standards-based approach is one characterized by a very high level of transparency. In other words, it's made clear what the achievement outcomes should be in the different learning areas at each year level in school. So you can look at the website and find out what those achievement outcomes are associated with different subjects at different year levels. The standards of attainment are also made very explicit. In other words, students and parents and teachers know that there will be different standards of performance that are possible in a particular subject at a particular year level. And those standards are graded from A through to E. So for example, an A means that a student has attained or demonstrated an excellent achievement in terms of what's been expected of them. B, a high achievement. C, satisfactory achievement. D, partial achievement. And E, limited achievement. The idea here is that students and parents and teachers should receive or have access to information about the extent of the achievement of certain prescribed learning outcomes on the part of the students. The focus, what's important is the expectations and the transparency. These are the key characteristics of this process. This process has been in place across all Schools in the country up to year 10, up to and including year 10 since 2014, and more recently it has been widely adopted across the final 2 years of schooling, years 11 and 12. This is an example of the kind of grading scheme. In this case, the subject is mathematics. It's senior level mathematics. I mentioned earlier that a B grade is a student is demonstrating a high level of achievement, and a C grade, a student is demonstrating a satisfactory level of achievement. So what's the difference between them? Well, as you cast your eye down the columns, first of all, you'll notice that the descriptions are fairly general in nature. They do address items of content, but in a general way. It's a fairly short description of what the students might have achieved over the course of a year of study. When you compare the left-hand column with the right-hand column, the major difference is the addition of an ability to solve non-routine problems. And students who can solve non-routine problems competently will receive a high achievement grade, whereas those who are competent, but mainly in solving routine problems, will receive a satisfactory achievement. When I refer to non-routine problems here in the context of mathematics, I'm talking about problems that are not standard in terms of their solution. In other words, there may be different ways of solving the problem, or there may be a variety of approaches required in order to solve the problem. In other words, they're not simple, straightforward problems. They're more complex, and they require a level of creativity on the part of the student in order to solve the problem. What I want to emphasize here is that these standards are transparent. Students know what they are, their parents know what they are, and teachers work to them. And each student, if given a C grade, for example, should understand that that grade has been given in recognition of the fact that the student has been very competent in addressing routine problems. And the point being made is that in order to achieve a higher standard, the student would need to master an ability with non-routine problems. We turn now to the second approach to assessment, which is competency-based assessment. Competency-based assessment in the context of Australia is particular to the vocational education and training sector. This is the only sector really that's using competency-based assessment to a very large extent, in fact, almost entirely. The competencies in question are made transparent to the students. This is important. It's, just as with standards-based assessment, in competency-based assessment, there is documentation indicating what the competencies are that the student needs to master. In my paper, I gave an example of a competency-based training program in bricklaying. That is, putting bricks in place to build a house or to build a pathway, or even to contribute to the building of a road. So the skills that somebody who's training to be a bricklayer needs to master are clearly documented in the information that's given in the training package. And the students know when they're studying that material that in the assessment, what they will be required to do is to show that they have mastered the skill. And the only result they'll get will be either satisfied or not satisfied. In other words, either they can do it or they can't do it. So there's no grading in the same way as we find in the school sector of A, B, C, D, or E. It's either satisfied or not satisfied. So competency is very skill-oriented, skill-based, and appropriate to the kinds of training programs that are delivered in the vocational education and training sector. I used this diagram. It's really about mastery learning, but I think that the little circles draw attention to different aspects of competency-based assessment and learning that are relevant. So working from the left, multiple explicit competencies, and that's very much the case. If you take the time to look at the website for ASQA, you can find training packages for different trades, and they will have very detailed, very explicit statements of what students need to learn. Some of these training packages are for areas with a fairly basic level of skill. Others are really quite complex. So for example, in areas of satellite technology, for example, the skills will be complex, but the statement of them will be straightforward and easy to comprehend. And it will be complete because the students work towards exactly what's in the package. Clear learning outcomes. The learning outcomes are made explicit. There's a rating system, and the rating system is generally the satisfied or not satisfied. In the teaching, there will be differentiated timely supports, meaningful positive assessment. Well, I'll come back to the topic of meaningful positive assessment in a moment, because that takes in the topic of formative assessment. But the assessment process in the context of the vocational education and training sector is fairly thorough. For example, when students are being assessed, one of the requirements is that the assessment should take place in the actual work environment that relates to the area of training that they're doing. So the bricklayer, for example, is taken to a site where people are laying bricks and is assessed on the skills that have been acquired during the learning of the training material. If that can't be done, then authentic learning environments are created that duplicate or replicate the actual practice environment, and the students undertake the assessment in that duplicated or replicated environment. Personalized learning, I'll come back to that, and advancement upon mastery. So the focus is very much on mastery in competency-based assessment. Now I turn to outcomes-based assessment, which is what I'm most familiar with in the context of universities. The language of outcomes-based assessment overlaps to an extent with standards-based assessment, and sometimes it's difficult to see the difference between them. Features of outcomes-based assessment are, first of all, that the learning outcomes are made clear to students, and this happens routinely in universities. In my paper, I've given you an example of the learning outcomes that are required for a 3-year degree in chemistry. And those outcomes are sufficiently explicit so that a student will know exactly what's expected of them during the course of their studies in the area of chemistry. There are 2 levels at which this works, however. The first level is the basic subject level, or the major level, and the outcomes there are generally expressed in a way that reflects the Bloom taxonomy. So in other words, the objectives are usually linked to cognitive processing or affective considerations. At the global level, however, there are also these things called graduate attributes. And these are more general in nature. And as students work through the individual units in a degree program, it is expected that those units will provide them with opportunities to achieve a high level of outcome in relation to some generic graduate attributes that are appropriate to the program that they're completing. One of them, for example, is communication skills. And so across a course in chemistry, for example, students will be required to engage in learning activities and accessible learning activities that relate to their capacity to express themselves verbally and orally. So there are graduate attributes which are one level of outcomes, and then at the more focused level, there are behavioral statements of expected learning outcomes. Again, transparency comes into it, and standards of attainment are usually made available to students, but not to the same extent that you see in schools. What's much more likely is that individual units of study, the person in charge of the unit will have developed a rubric which identifies what the key criteria are that the student should attend to. And that rubric will also indicate what a high distinction level of performance is, a distinction, a credit, a pass, or whatever. So it's a little bit like standards-based assessment, but not as rigid and much more under the control of the individual lecturer or the individual school. This is an example of a global statement of a distinction standard, and this is pretty typical in an outcomes-based assessment. So you can see that to get a distinction, the student's performance, in addition to satisfying all the basic learning requirements, demonstrates distinctive insight and ability in researching, analysing, and applying. Note those terms: researching, analysing, applying. So coming pretty much from Bloom's taxonomy. Relevant skills and concepts, and shows a well-developed to synthesize, integrate, and evaluate. Those skills again are higher cognitive learning skills, and that's appropriate to a university course, and particularly to somebody who is going to be given a distinction grade. The student's performance could be described as distinguished in relation to the learning requirements specified. Now, what I do typically is, when I'm grading a piece of work, I grade it against the criteria using a rubric. So in other words, against maybe 5 or 6 key criteria, I will grade the student's work as being high distinction, distinction, credit, or pass, and hopefully never fail. But what I also do is come back to this global statement, and there are global statements of this nature for distinction, high distinction, credit, and so on, and basically make a judgment, a personal, informed, professional judgment about the student's work. The question is it of distinction standard? And so I refer to this statement of standard that applies to a distinction. And that's usually the basis on which we award grades for performance in individual units. At this point, then, I want to turn to the third of the topics that I wished to speak with you about this morning, and that's to do with some noteworthy trends. The 3 trends that I've identified relate to, first of all, the abandonment of norm-based approaches to student assessment. The second is more use of formative assessment, and the third has to do with the use of information and communication technologies. There are various other trends that I could have selected, so this is not an exclusive list. There are lots of other things happening in student assessment in Australia, but these were 3 that seemed to me to stand out, and also that I thought might be relevant to a Vietnamese audience. Let me deal with the first of them, norm-based. The norm-based approach is one that's pretty much focused on coming up with a distribution of scores and a ranking of students. Now, without going into the detail of it, basically the idea of norm-based ranking is that anyone's performance in an exam can be compared with a cohort set of standards or even a national set of standards, and it's possible to locate the performance of the individual in relation to the whole. More importantly, the individual's performance will be different from the performance of others and you can say that some have done better in the exam than others. This is the regime of assessment that I experienced when I was a school student, and I can well remember that the only thing that mattered in my schooling, apart from the fact that I enjoyed it, was where I came in the class. That mattered to me a great deal. It mattered to my parents. And the purpose of assessment was very much along the lines of creating a spread of results so that those of us who had done well could get a high placement, and those of us who had not done well ranked much lower. In other words, the focus of the assessment was to come up with a distribution of scores that would then enable the ranking of students. And this ranking was very important because if you didn't do very well or get a high rank, you sometimes were told you couldn't go to the next year level. And towards the end of schooling, if you didn't get a high rank, you were told you couldn't go to university. So that's the norm-based approach. The focus is on comparison of performance. The popularity of this approach has declined a lot since the 1970s. It hasn't fully declined. There are some areas where it's still practiced, and some individual teachers and parents, probably parents more than teachers, still cling to this approach. But by and large, it doesn't exist officially, and in fact, it's not endorsed by any of the three bodies that I referred to earlier, that is, ACARA, ASQA, or TEXA. It was abandoned because, first of all, in order to get a norm-based approach to assessment working effectively, you really need rigorous summative assessments, and these usually take the form of end of semester or end of year examinations that are high stakes. That is, there's a lot of pressure. Now, teachers and parents can be attracted to that, but school systems were finding that these were very hard to organize. And the cost of them, for example, was such that there was an inclination to start looking for something else. A second consideration was that these exams very often reinforced social inequity. So students who might be of equivalent ability might be coming from quite different home backgrounds. And one home background may be very supportive of their ability to do well in the examination. The other home background may not be. And so the process then reinforced those social differences. And that was very obvious when you looked at who went on to the higher levels of schooling and who went to university. And it was clear that the assessment procedures were reinforcing social inequalities. Third, and probably most important, the system of summative examinations and a norm-based approach to assessment was reinforcing practices that research started to show were not beneficial in terms of lifelong learning or indeed success in learning. Students were cramming, they were studying material very superficially, they weren't exploring it either from the point of view of its relevance to their lives or to the lives of people around them. They were just, the key question was, what's on the exam? What do I need to learn? So there was cramming for the exam and a lot of rote learning. And at all levels within the system, that was frowned upon, but research showed it to be ultimately not a good practice. So against that background, then the first trend I'm referring to is the abandonment of the norm-based approach, and those are some of the reasons. The second trend is a far greater use of formative assessment. Formative assessment is the kind of assessment that seeks to enable a student to improve their performance on a task. In other words, it's formative. It's helping them to form a better understanding, better knowledge, better skills. It's in contrast to formative assessment is summative assessment. And summative assessment, as it says there, a summative assessment task cannot be repeated or improved. In other words, you get one shot with a summative assessment, and you get the outcome based on that shot. But formative is different. Formative involves, in most cases, a three-step process. First of all, you set an assessment task, so the students perform the task. Then you provide the students with constructive feedback, and that can include peer group feedback. And a jargonish word often used here is scaffolding. In other words, the students have their learning scaffolded by the teacher or by their peers. And then the students do the task again, and hopefully there will be an improvement. So the benefits here are that the students learn from their mistakes and have an opportunity to improve. This kind of assessment is very common in schools in Australia. In fact, it's widespread. It's common enough in the vocational education and training sector, and it's not practiced enough in universities. I do practice this form of assessment. For example, I typically give students an assessment task. It might be to undertake some research. I then receive their reports. I provide them with feedback, and the feedback is in the form of what they might do better or additional material they might look up. And then they've got time to improve, and then they submit the final report. I have to say, some students take no notice. All my feedback is wasted. But many students do take notice. And it's clear from the feedback they give me on my teaching that they appreciate the opportunity to learn by being able to do the task, make the mistakes, and then learn from their own mistakes. Now that's formative assessment. This word formative assessment, though, is very widely used, and sometimes it's confused with the provision of formative feedback, which is a normal kind of practice in a schoolroom where the student says something and the teacher corrects the student, and the student hopefully has learned from the correction. So that's formative feedback. But formative assessment is more formal in structure in that there is a test being given or a task being given to the students from which they can learn, and then they can improve on their performance in light of the feedback they've received. The third trend that I referred to is the use of information and communication technologies. This is a very fast-moving area, and I mean, over the past 20 years, excuse me, over the past 20 years, the change has been quite remarkable. Most of my communication about assessment with students now is done electronically. I send the tasks to the students electronically. I receive the reports from them electronically. Those reports, of course, contribute to their final grade, so they're part of the assessment. With the use of information and communication technologies, I'm able to create learning groups for the students. I'm able to encourage them to perform a wider range of tasks than just simply writing essays. So for example, they can produce websites, or they can produce infographics. There are different learning activities that I can give to the students by use of information and communication technologies. In the area of assessment, however, the use of information and communication technologies is still developing, but it's developing very rapidly. And as I refer to in the paper, you'll now find at many Australian universities advisory sheets for staff about how to use ICTs in the context of student assessment. Some of the technology is extraordinary. For example, it's now possible for a student to sit for an exam and for the system to have closed down that student's internet connection for the duration of the exam, and also to observe the student's performance using the video camera to make sure that there's no cheating. Now, this kind of thing can happen to an extent with universities. That's much less common and would be much more difficult in the context of schools and the vocational education and training sector. For obvious reasons, not all students have expensive computers. So I move through to my concluding remarks. The point I would make here is that, as a general point, that like many things in life, student assessment is very influenced by culture, and culture evolves over time. In the Australian context, culture has certainly evolved. Things have changed so much since I started university a long, long time ago. The culture now is one in which formative assessment is more encouraged, certainly in schools, and the practices that I was brought up with in school of norm-based assessment are pretty much gone. So there's been a major change. At the moment, we're experiencing COVID, and one of the implications of COVID is that there's a scramble to figure out what we can do using ICTs that would simulate what we used to do when we weren't using them quite so much. And that's bringing about dramatic change in terms of the use of these technologies in the context of student assessment. I should draw things to a close at that point, and will end by saying thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rector. Thank you for your insight talk. Thank you for visualizing the whole system of assessment applied in Australian education system. I'm fascinated with the ideas of using different assessment for different education level and the abandonment of norm-based approach. We received quite a lot of questions here, and I would like to raise the first question by Hoàng Phước Lộc. He asked, what is tool or environment that education students practicing for enhancing assessment competency in education colleagues in Australia? Can you please share with us your opinion?
Okay, I'm terribly sorry I was distracted because I was trying to get rid of the slides. I wonder if you could ask me again.
Sure. Yes, the question is, what is tool or environment that education students practicing for enhancing assessment competency in education colleagues in Australia? And also the question is shown on the Q&A tool.
Okay, thank you. I think the question is about in teacher education programs, what do the students learn about assessment? It's a very interesting question because 20 years ago, they weren't learning a great deal. There's been a big change over the last 20 years in terms of what's included. Students are now required as part of the program of study, particularly in the areas where they're studying about how to teach mathematics or how to teach geography or creative arts. They're actually given a lot of opportunity to develop both summative and formative assessment tasks, and they are supported in this process. I think most students find it easier to develop summative assessment tasks because they've been used to it during their school experience. Many find the process of developing formative assessment tasks not difficult, but a new experience. And I think they value the opportunity. Bit by bit, I'm pleased to say, our students are appreciating to a greater extent than ever before the power of formative assessment.
Yes, thank you very much. Concerning about the formative assessment, we also received one question about the assessment. The question is, how can a lecturer facilitate his formative assessment, especially formative feedback to students in larger classes? So this regards to the large classes, how the teacher carried out the formative feedback and formative assessment.
It's again a very interesting question. In the context of universities, it is challenging to create formative assessment. It's challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a strong pressure on all of us to be engaged in research. So we tend to minimize not minimize, but certainly be very efficient in our approach to teaching. There is no doubt that formative assessment takes more time, no doubt at all. So in order to implement formative assessment, one of the requirements is to have time. Let me just read something, if I may, from the PhD thesis completed by my PhD candidate from Vietnam. She wrote about staff who routinely implemented formative assessment practices on a purely voluntary basis, with no formal or departmental recognition or time allocation provided for what they were doing. They reported, however, that their colleagues were generally respectful of what they were doing. That's interesting. From their point of view, though, the culture in which they worked was dominated by summative and norm-referenced approaches to student assessment. And they knew well that when submitting final grades for their students, they were also required to arrive at a distribution of grades that would correspond with acceptable norms within their faculties. I don't know if that is a true picture of your experience of the situation in Vietnam. That would have been true in Australia maybe 20 years ago in universities. But I think the culture has changed. And I think now there's acceptance of the value of formative assessment. But it is true that people like me who are committed to it need to put more time into the exercise, because you do spend a lot more time providing feedback to students. Now, the issue is, what do you do when you've got a very large group of students, 300, 500, 2,000 students? Well, clearly, the system we have is that there will be one key lecturer, and then there'll be various assistant lecturers. So one way of doing it is to break people up into smaller groups. The other way of doing it is to get students to comment on each other's work. And this is possible with information and communication technology, so that it's made clear to them when they put in a submission that it will be shown to maybe 10 or 15 other students who will be asked to provide comment. And that's the kind of constructive feedback that may be helpful to the student, even though it's coming from other students. Now, that in turn needs to be supported so that all students know what they should be looking for when they're providing feedback, in order to be useful to for the feedback to be useful to the individual student.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure that for a large class and the work of teacher, the workload of the lecturer will be like enormous. And without the help of the ICT and the tutors and assistants, we can't make it. Like, as you know, like in Vietnam, we have like huge class, and it's really difficult for the lecturers to supervise all the work of the students. And so as one said, like a teacher or a lecturer is kind of a Superman, like doing everything, juggle things and stuff. And we received one question by Mr. Nguyễn Vinh Quang. He asked, in Australia, is teacher training classified as vocational or tertiary training?
It's classified as tertiary training. The students coming into teaching may well have already completed another degree, and then they come to do a 2-year program at master's degree level in order to qualify as a teacher. The alternative is for them to do a 4-year undergraduate program, and in that undergraduate program, they will need to have studied at least 2 years in a discipline area in which they're going to be teaching. In the case of students going on to be primary school teachers, there's less focus on discipline knowledge and much more focus on aspects of child development. But all students coming into teacher education are regarded as doing an undergraduate degree, or if they already have one, they complete a master's degree in order to become a teacher.
Wow, okay, that's very clear. And I think that answered the second question of Mr. Quang about the assessment of the outcome capacity of teacher training as well. And one more question regarding the school sectors. Could you please clarify the roles and responsibilities of the state government's agency of education in the implementation of curriculum and students' assessment? What are their roles in implementing the assessment?
In the schools sector, the national body is ACARA, the one I referred to earlier on. And that body determines the curriculum. And it also determines how students will be assessed. The appointment of teachers is done at a state level. And the conditions under which teachers perform their tasks, those conditions are determined by state or territory authorities. They're not determined nationally by a national body. This is an area of tension. I referred to it earlier on because states and territories have been used to running schools for a very long time. And there's still a process of adjustment to the idea of a national body determining what the curriculum should be. But over time, the national body has been very successful, and the Australian curriculum is now very much adopted and widely implemented, but the conditions under which it's implemented are determined by state authorities. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, it's very clear. And also regarding about the stakeholders, and we received one question from Ms. Phương Cao. She said, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. My observation is that the Vietnamese context, teachers' assessment practices are much influenced by high-stake exams. And her question is, could you please suggest how Vietnam prepares in-service teachers' assessment literacy to carry out formative assessment in practice?
I think the best way forward is for the students to be introduced to the research on formative assessment. The studies by two English scholars, Black and William, is very clear. The benefits of formative assessment are really very profound. And that research has been replicated time and again, and all of the research points to the strengths of formative assessment. I think as part of their studies, teacher education students need to become familiar with that research. In terms of the mechanics of getting it into programs, I think really it's a matter of time. There has been slow cultural change in the Australian education system. We weren't talking about formative assessment 20 years ago, and now it's widely practiced, especially in schools. So there has been a big change. And I predict the same thing is going to happen in Vietnam because the research points to the value of formative assessment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And we receive a lot of questions, and the audience are really interested and they want to hear more of your opinions on many things. For example, we received one question from Ms. Thùy Tăng, and she wanted to know about the why competency-based grading in vocational education only have two levels, satisfied and unsatisfied, while the other, like the school sectors and higher education, grading can use with 5 levels and 4 levels. So if they use grading with 2 levels, does it mean that they just want to focus on summative assessment?
An interesting question. The context of vocational education and training is very skills oriented. Those skills can be sophisticated. There's no doubt about that. In other words, being able to read a set of regulations before you start building a house is very important. Because if you don't read the regulations and you build the house, it can cost somebody a lot of money if the house subsequently is not compliant with the regulations. So the skills can be complex, but either the students can do it or they can't do it. If they can do it, then they're capable of and particularly if they can do all the skills, they're capable of being qualified for basically a trade qualification. In the schools sector, if you take mathematics, for example, no matter how hard you try, some students will find difficulty, extreme difficulty, solving non-routine mathematical problems. And so it would be inappropriate to have a pass or fail or satisfied, not satisfied criterion. It wouldn't mean a great deal because the students may well be quite competent with routine mathematical problems, but not competent with non-routine problems. And so you need a wider scale. And the same in universities. Having just satisfied or not satisfied would be inappropriate in most cases because some students are much more capable than others and can deal with very complex issues, cognitive issues, in a way that many other students can't. You really do need to accommodate that in your grading scale. I guess one of the things is, though, that even in universities, in some parts of universities, there is competency-based teaching and grading. For example, in areas of medicine, I mean, either you can use a stethoscope to hear somebody's heart or you can't. It's one or the other. And so that's a basic skill that trainee doctors need to learn. Similarly, taking blood pressure. And of course, there are much more complex skills. And so there will be a competency element in the grading process. But overall, the grading process is outcomes-based.
Yeah, thank you very much. We received a lot of questions, but due to limited time, we can just have one more questions only. And I received a very interesting question from Ms. Nguyễn Thị Nhài. She asked, do you think that practicing formative assessment means that teachers have to do more work? So paying more effort, but they don't get paid more. So talking about money, so what do you think? Should we like do with the formative assessment, do more work and we don't get paid? So how about in Australia?
It's funny that, well, I'm going to speak about Vietnam first of all. The head of a department said, because of the low salary and the shortage of financial incentives, whenever I raise the issue of implementing formative assessment, my staff always ask me, will we be paid more for doing the job? So I'm only able to encourage those who are interested and enthusiastic in making change by themselves. That's a comment from the head of a department in a university in Vietnam. I think in Australia, the salary level for teachers is really adequate. It's sufficient that they don't need to take on second jobs in order to maintain their family. It's a feature of our system that teachers are, generally speaking, paid moderately good salaries. Therefore, they are more of a position to take more time to focus on things like formative assessment. But the critical thing is the cultural influence. And, you know, we're all influenced by culture. And the culture in Australia has very definitely swung in the direction of formative assessment, especially in schools, to a certain extent in vocational education and training, and slowly in universities. And the problem in universities is not salary, it's time. And the fact that staff feel they're under enormous pressure to do research and therefore are less likely to take the time to focus on creating the conditions that are appropriate for formative assessment.
We received one more question regarding about the rubrics. So I don't know if like you can spend 1 or 2 more minutes and share with us. Thank you. So we received the question from Ms. Trần Thị Hoài, and she said in one of our project of evaluating 23 training programs within VNU, it has been found that learning assessment activities in more than half of them were not based on established criteria, that is the rubric. Could you please share some experience in how to foster lecturers to develop criteria for assessment and practice criteria in assessment?
Okay. I'd love to spend more time explaining these things to you, but unfortunately, given the limits of our engagement, it's difficult. Rubrics are now widely used. I just use my university as an example. Rubrics are now widely used. So the question is, why? The first reason is that the big chiefs, the people in charge of the university, have decided that they're important. Why? Because external bodies are saying to universities that their approaches to assessment need to improve. So therefore, our president says we really should improve the way in which we assess students. And advisors say, well, one way of doing it is to get staff to use rubrics. So that then goes to the deans of faculties, and they're told, okay, we want to see more use of rubrics. And the deans of faculties go to the heads of departments and they say, okay, we want to see more rubrics. And then it goes to academic staff and they ask the question, what is a rubric? So within our university, we have officers that are responsible for assisting staff to develop the quality of their programs. And those people are trained in areas of teaching and learning, and they're able to support staff to develop rubrics. We also have quality accreditation and quality assurance processes so that our programs are reviewed from time to time by people who know what should be in them. And if it stands out that somebody is not making use of a rubric, then there will be questions asked about why they've elected not to use one. Rubrics are not the 100% answer to every problem. They do have limitations, but they at least convey to students what it is they're being assessed on, and also gives them a sense of where their standard of performance compares with standards that are higher. And that then helps them to figure out how they might improve. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And we are so much clearer about the assessment and education system in Australia. Although we have many more questions and sharing we want to ask you, but due to our limited time, we will shelve it to the next meeting. Thank you very much, Professor Hayden, for the insight talk. We appreciate that. Thank you.
I've greatly enjoyed presenting. Thank you. And
sure we are. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.